But first, Rachel and Caitlin, communication has been weaponized. Explain what this looks like, what it means, and what our response should be. Rachel first.
Hi, it's great to be here with all of you and excited to have this subject receive so much attention. So when communication is weaponized, and this is something I've studied internationally and in conflict contexts, and that we can start to see playing out, especially around this issue of immigration in the US, I think we're all familiar with this idea of creating us-them divides, and they happen along patterns. So communication is used to portray an other, and that other is given certain characteristics. It's most commonly portrayed as a threat to a way of life, to security and safety, and to purity. Is portrayed as already being responsible for bad things, whether that's economic downturn or having committed violence in the past, and is portrayed as being not fully human or not quite like us. What we often overlook in the weaponization of communication is that it doesn't only focus on creating an other, it also very powerfully creates a very salient and a very strong idea of the us that is deserving of protection, of vengeance, and of righting wrongs. And so alongside these othering narratives, we get these protection narratives, these narratives that say we need to protect the vulnerable, women and children. We need to protect our group. We need to make things right from these wrongs that have happened. And in that creation of an us, there's this powerful exertion of pressure, of peer pressure that says you must go along with our group. And in the US, this is very complicated by, as Dr. Gest talked about, the sort of political polarization, partisan polarization, and the use of immigration as sort of a wedge issue within that. And so we move from the space of debating policy solutions that work for a society and into a space of competition and threat and pressures between groups.
And Caitlin, what should our response be?
The response should look like a knock on the door, eye contact, a hug. Like, it should be a lot of human contact, especially between people who disagree. So humanizing people who hold more progressive values by showing up and doing non-judgmental listening and having that conversation. And then once you've established that positive rapport, then asking open-ended questions and storytelling. So asking about their own stories and sharing your own stories. So we stay as far away from facts, opinions, beliefs, thoughts as possible. We never share those things. We only share stories and emotion, and we only ask for stories and emotions. So if they are, we give them space to rant for like 2 minutes, and then we keep asking questions about who they know, who's moved to the US, who they were closest to, what that person's story was, if they ever became documented or not. And we utilize a lot of the balanced core belief messages that Mohammed had shared as well.
So a very human response, as you say, no facts and figures, anything like that. So therefore, Justin and Kimberly, and you can all just be on camera for this panel discussion. What should be foremost in our minds when approaching these audiences, both in terms of looking inward at ourselves and then thinking about our audience?
I'll share a couple that come to mind for me, and thinking about the audience, curiosity. So approaching, trying to question assumptions and lead from a place of curiosity about this audience. And then in terms of thinking about ourselves, you know, I heard so many times from so many canvassers how this process of talking to people who we sort of didn't think would agree with us helped reveal some of our own biases. So I'm remembering a canvasser saying how she would see an American flag on a house and immediately think this person's probably not going to be in the supportive of me and my family and where I come from and how I got here, and how even just that American flag was a trigger for her, and how she began to recognize that and check it and say, you know, let me be curious, and to not be judgmental of self for that trigger too, that like there is probably a reason why there's some of those biases. It may be experience, it may be something that we've been told or taught, but that to just recognize it, check it, and then get back to that curious place of like, I haven't met this person yet. Let me try and give them the benefit of the doubt as I approach them and engage in conversation.
Justin?
Thanks, Denzil. It's a great question. You know, so many of our relationships today are instrumental and transactional in nature, that people are used to people wanting something from them when they're being approached with information or when they're being approached at someone at their door. And I think that the quickest way to actually having meaningful conversations and dealing with the politics of persuasion is to actually deactivate, to disarm the folks that you're talking to. And this can be whether it's a door-to-door conversation, a conversation at a bar, or even an information campaign. The bottom line here is if the folks that you're speaking with do not think that they have a way of identifying with you, if they don't think that you are ultimately interested in the same things that they are interested in, if they don't think that you have a sense of shared experience, then they don't care what your 5-point plan is. They don't care what your facts are. The conversation cannot begin until you foster that human connection. And whether it is through the immediacy of a hug or eye contact, or just through the good listening skills that come with actually having a conversation, validating and valuing what people are saying, acknowledging and recognizing their perspective as legitimate and important, even if you disagree, is the first key to actually opening the doors to these new ideas. And I think it's really important to adjust our minds in these ways when we go into these discussions. The folks that you're interacting with are not blind and you are giving them sight. That's not how it's working. They believe that they see the world perfectly fine, thank you very much. What you are doing is working inside of the boundaries of that world. You're working inside of those experiences and helping them see the world in a different way, even though they have been seeing it all along.
How do we put that into practice? What does occupying their world look like? I want all of you to respond maybe in 30 seconds. Give us those strategies of engaging with people, both in person, through different sorts of campaigns, different channels. Caitlin, we can start with you.
Sure, yeah. So actually, in one part of our Deep Canvas script, what we do is we ask people about when was the time in your life when you were really struggling and needed support. And I realized that that amount of care and respect is something that I don't even do with half of my loved ones. You know, I can have a more respectful relationship on the door than with people in my own life. So I would recommend starting there.
Rachel?
One thing that comes to mind listening to this conversation is a sort of off-the-cuff comment made by this social psychologist, Matt Modell. We were talking about emotional versus rational approaches. And he put it as, we like to think that we're rational dogs with emotional tails, but we're actually emotional dogs with rational tails. We lead with our emotions. And I think so much of that can inform the approaches that we take. When we look at some of what's shaping people's opinions around immigration, so much of it has to do with emotions. And so we can look at the emotions not as the end-all be-all, but as the pathway into connecting with someone. And when we think of ourselves or others who are going out there to become messengers, we have to remember that the messenger is as important as the message. Listening to someone, showing you care about them, learning about how they feel and where they're at is a way of building trust. It shows not just I'm competent, I know better than you, but I care about you, I care about what's best for you. And if we think about how we all evaluate whether we care what someone has to say or we think it's relevant to us, those things matter. So we can think about establishing the credibility of the messenger and recognizing there's no one magical message that's going to transform how someone thinks about immigration. Right? It's going to be about learning about them and then tailoring messages. So if we think about it as a process and building the messengers and the trust, not just the message, we see the emotion as the way in, but not the end all be all.
What were some of your experiences, Kimberly, in the field with your messengers?
I want to echo Rachel's point about trust and relationship building and how vital and important I think that is. As somebody who operates in a movement space in California, you know, this work has challenged me to continuously ask the question, as I am advocating and allying in a way that's about the humanity of my friends and family members who are undocumented, am I seeing the humanity of this audience? And am I risking that I'm othering this audience as I'm asking them not to other my friends and family? And I think that that core question of posture has been a really important one in working to get to a place of seeing the humanity of the folks that I'm talking to who may not agree with me on a set of issues as a place to build connection from. And I just would want to echo using questions as a way to do that. My favorite question to ask is, what's behind that for you? And then to keep asking that to understand better, what's behind that for you? Like, what's going on there? Tell me more. What's behind that for you?
Justin?
That reminds me actually of our colleague Wendy Felice's 5 whys. Rather than what's behind that, she advocates asking why. You know, tell us why, give us the backstory. It's very important. The key here is listening. Listen, and listen some more. Listening is the pathway to credibility. When I was doing my field work on white working class communities in the upper Midwest and also in Britain, people used to ask me, don't you feel like you're in danger? Do these people want to talk to you? And the answer was always, no, it's quite the opposite. People were thrilled to talk to me. This was the first time that they have actually had someone who was actually from the outside who cared to listen to what they had to say. They were blown away by this idea that someone would come to them to solicit their views. Listening is the path to credibility. If I could just give one small example that everyone I think will appreciate because they watch TV all the time, I'm sure. Donald Trump went on the stump in Nevada in August 2016, and he made a comment that made a lot of people inside of the Washington Beltway cringe. He said, "I love poorly educated people." And everyone inside the Beltway said, "Oh my gosh, that's so awkward. Who says that?" But in the world that I was in Youngstown, Ohio and elsewhere, when they heard him say that, they said the same thing. Who says that? But in a good way. Who's ever said that they actually care about poorly educated people? Who has said that, who has rendered them a sense of status and called a name to their plight and actually said that they care? Now, the authenticity of it aside, the fact that it was rhetorically said and so publicly was important. And I think that we have to give that kind of legitimacy and acknowledgement to people. And the way to do that is through listening.
Which brings up this point, Justin, that your research showed many Americans are being driven by this sense of deprivation, this fear that the U.S. is changing and not for the better and that they are not involved in that change. How can our language, when we're talking about immigration, be welcoming to immigrants, but also make U.S.-born people feel at home? Justin and Rachel.
Well, we have to begin by revering that heritage. So much of the politics of immigration today is about condemning the past. And pushing people into a somewhat uncertain future. And I think that we have to revere that past as well and draw strength from that past and legitimize that past. The sense of loss is a nostalgic kind of loss. People believe that they were better off, whether they were more socially mobile, whether they were more politically powerful in yesteryear. And we can't just simply go out and denigrate that time as being backward or terrible, at least not all backwards and terrible. We have to acknowledge that we find strength from the past and we use that as a platform, a foundation for a future that we're all together in. So much of the politics of immigration is that people feel unconsulted about the influx of people. And so we have to render people a sense of control, a sense of consultation, that we're not just throwing them into this uncertain future, but that we're deriving strength from their past that they value.
Rachel, this is a tough thing for us to do, but what do you suggest?
So the way that I would look at it, going back to this idea of how communication is weaponized to turn this from a collective issue that we all want to solve into this competition between groups. The question here, and there's a lot of work that's done about how do you tackle the narratives of othering. I think where we also have to focus attention is on how do we redefine different versions of us. We all have all different identities, and I think there's a real opportunity and a need to activate more collectivized identities. So for example, you could use a geographic localized identity. You could use an identity around a local sports team or around mothers in a particular area. Finding identities that unite across lines that are being used to divide can be a really powerful way to help people see interdependence and a shared future. And this comes back to the need to meet an emotion with an emotion. If there's a sense of loss, deprivation, anxiety, it's not just about diving deep into that. It's important to understand that. It's also about providing a competitive emotion to that. So if I'm scared, I want to hold someone's hand. I want someone to be there with me if I'm hearing footsteps in my house or something like that at night. That's an emotional response, right? Having someone with you doesn't necessarily make you more safe, but we look for belonging. We look for another emotionally resonant experience. And it's the same when there are these narratives of threat in society as there are about immigrants and immigration right now, right? People look for belonging. And right now that happens to fall along partisan divides and things like that. But if we can find alternative forms of belonging, of redefining this us, of leveraging local identities, we can compete with the deprivation, the sense of hopelessness, by providing a different vehicle, one that provides a different version of an us, one that is inclusive, but through which people can realize their hopes, through which they can deal with their anxieties. And so I think we can think about messing up the landscape of how social identity is defined. And it's not just it's sticking to the existing us-them frame. It's redefining and introducing additional versions of the us. And I'll just add one tiny additional thing, which is we have to remember that because of the way this issue has been activated, people face a lot of pressure that if they want to belong to a group that they might be part of that is explicitly against immigration or has hardline views on it, they can't speak up even if they want to exercise compassion or a different point of view. So we need to find, we're so impacted by what we think our peers are doing or approve or disapprove of. We need to make it also safe for people that might want to express something different, but don't have a way to do so, to speak out and to do that.
Does that lend itself to more complex kinds of responses from us, Caitlin? Do we learn from Mohammed that we sort of balance out, their concerns with our concerns? And when it comes to immigration, we're in this age of tweets and sound bites. Is more complex messaging on immigration actually the key?
I believe so, because people can just see a fact, see a sound bite, and if they agree with it, it confirms them. If they disagree with it, they think it's fake. And the more complex messaging that does emphasize the emotions of immigrant experiences is more inviting, and it allows people to feel empathy and to imagine what it might be like to be in those people's shoes, or to think about, oh, I felt a very similar way one time. So emphasizing the story. Also, I wanted to address a question I saw, which also answers your question about what happens if they really disagree, and how do you don't want to do like a bait and switch, right? You don't want to be like, oh, I really care about you. Now, here's what I think about immigration. What I find it's best to do is be smiling, be open, calm, but be firm about how you feel from the very beginning. Like, I really appreciate your honesty in telling me what you think, but I'm very in favor of people who are undocumented here being able to apply for citizenship, or I'm against deportations. And I want to know, who do you know who was an immigrant or who's moved to this country? And then sharing a story that's sort of respectful, but still honest conversation is what's required.
And Kimberly, a lot of what we do takes place online, on social media. Do you have any advice for us when it comes to communicating about this and trying to connect with people? In a previous webinar, we learned that, for instance, when you post something, you're not necessarily trying to convince an individual, but you're doing it for the benefit of everyone else reading your comments. What else would you have for us, Kimberly?
Yeah, I find online climates to be very challenging ones in which to have conversations. And for me, there's just this like inverse of like, what's the degree of relationship to the person that I'm having an online conversation with? So because relationship enables agitation, and if we're not in robust relationship, the degree to which I'm going to be able to constructively agitate, to raise the consciousness of someone, to not just like tell them a new way to think, but to invite them to think differently, is probably going to be more limited. Whereas when I'm in relationship with someone, particularly deep relationship, my ability to do that gets bigger. And so when I think about social media, for me, it's always a calculation of relationship first and foremost, to be able to discern, is this my grandma that I'm talking to on social media, or is this somebody who just came to the page, who I maybe don't know very well and don't have a lot of baseline with. And then that will dictate kind of how response will go. And particularly if there's deep relationship, I try to take it off of online and actually take it into real person space. And I know that that's not always possible to do. And in which case, I think being able to use some of those same strategies that are, again, thinking about problematizing with questions, being, coming from that posture that Caitlin has described of being respectful, of acknowledging concerns, but also being really clear about where I stand on the issues, and being clear about my values is really important.
All right. Mohammed, I want you to join us for these last few minutes. We will take some questions from our attendees, but particularly for you and Justin, using the language of the other, illegal immigrant, illegal alien, for instance. Do you think that is acceptable in certain situations, or are we just reinforcing what we don't want to reinforce?
That's a fantastic question. I think what it potentially falls into, if using that language in specific regions of the country that are, I think, to some extent, buying into the narrative that those who are here that are undocumented potentially are, pose a greater criminal threat, et cetera. I think it falls into the trap of recycling the same kinds of language that have historically been used to marginalize certain segments of the population. I can tell you that we don't have any sort of data or statistical sort of relevance into whether using that kind of language could actually build relationship in order for you to move along on this issue. And so
Justin, what do you say to that?
I disagree, I'm afraid. So I think that language is symbolic, language is signaling. And so when I'm in Britain, I'm going to use British words to describe things, and because it creates a sense of solidarity, of mutual understanding. And frankly, the risk of reinforcing perceptions of illegality, when in fact, actually there was a law broken in these cases, reinforcing the sort of criminal nature of immigrants is a risk, but it's a marginal risk considering the gain that you can get from actually forming a bond with someone. And then you can get beyond such labels. But in many ways, by actually using these kinds of language, it's a way of actually establishing some kind of mutual understanding and acknowledgement early, rather than sort of scolding someone for actually speaking about things the wrong way. So much of my subjects from white working class backgrounds are concerned about talking about immigration because they fear that they'll be considered a racist and they'll be shut up because of it. They'll be silenced because of it. We need to encourage people to feel comfortable to speak the way they do and then to come to conclusions together.
So Caitlin and Kimberly, how do you shift from, Casey asks this, from making connections and telling stories to actually getting into the issues that you may disagree on with the person that you're talking to? And how do you deal with a negative reaction?
So sometimes I put on my Caitlin 10 years ago thinking hat. What was I like when I was living in these rural areas? And I actually shared a lot of the same beliefs that these people are sharing with me. And I say, I understand. I felt that way before too. And I'd be sure in my story to emphasize aspects of the story that contradict some of the things that they talked about. I say, this family I know, they've been paying taxes for 20 years and they're never going to get Social Security, or they haven't been able to access Medicaid or Medicare. And putting the facts in the story, and then the way that we pose our political ideas eventually is by more of like a comprehensive view of this system's broken, but so are the systems that you were impacted by. We're talking a lot with people about health insurance. And it's because our politicians aren't accountable to us, and we need to come together in order to make this change. So it's taking a little bit of a broader view of what politically needs to change and inviting them to be in this multiracial base of people who shares the same values.
Kimberly, when we get a negative reaction, how do we respond to that? How do we keep the conversation going and make them feel consulted?
Absolutely. I think embodying that golden rule, so continuing to remember, if someone was talking to me and and saw the world differently than I do, how would I want to be interacted with? Is a little bit of where I come from. And also getting really clear on when somebody disagrees, how hostile is disagreement? So I've seen some great questions in the chat around, like, as people are canvassing, particularly for people of color, for immigrants who are canvassing, for LGBTQ folks, what are, this can be, they are closer to the pain often. And so what does that mean in terms of emotional safety and physical safety? And that is something that was an utmost priority for us in having these conversations, is that first and foremost, we need to take care of each other. And as a Canvas team, need to be able to come home to each other every night and know that we will take care of each other. And I think one thing that's really important is beginning to recognize who really is hostile and maybe not ready for this conversation yet, and who isn't. And I think that's really key, and it's just something that has to get figured out. In our case, it was on the doors, learning that. I think it's with practice too, and having these conversations, and beginning to see and understand, what does movability really look like, and who are folks who are maybe just not ready for the conversation yet.
Justin, what should be, and Rachel, what should be our short-term and long-term goals with this? Let's say maybe within the next few weeks versus the next 12 months.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the kind of change that we're talking about is not a 2-week or even a 12-month ideal. We're talking about a 20 to 50-year process. And I don't mean to be exaggerating or hyperbolic about this. I actually mean that completely literally. I think this is a multi-generational project. And what we have to be thinking about is how to incrementally bring people closer to recognizing solidarity with immigrants, but also recognizing the integral nature of immigration into our country. And that's just not something that's going to happen overnight. We're talking about broader cultural change. I think that, a number of the questions inside of the chat area of this webinar are concerned about white fragility, white nationalism, sort of alt-right perspectives. One thing I think we have to recognize is that the move that we're trying to make, this incrementalism that we're talking about, is really going to be happening on the margins. We're not going to be speaking to people who view sort of Trumpian style policies as a sort of messianic arrival of a new America. That's not really the folks that we're really going to be trying to reach. It's actually what Mohammed was pointing to. It's the people who are exhausted by these debates, but who very much care about them. It's the people who are discomforted or uncertain or unconfident, and they're feeling insecure, that we want to actually bring them into the fold and make them feel like they matter. So I think that we have to focus our energies over the low-hanging fruit, around the people who actually are persuadable and actually are really sincerely interested in the plight of immigrants, but are trying to reconcile that with their other values. And I think that should help allow us to give clarity to how to deal with a lot of these issues. As it relates to race, if you don't mind, just one corollary. As it relates to race, the one thing you have to bear in mind is that educating people about white privilege and structural advantages in American society is not really going to go very far. And this was going back to what I was saying about listening. When I talk to some of my subjects about this, about the idea of structural advantage, one of my subjects said to me, I am one car accident, one unexpected medical bill from that trailer park over there. What disadvantage or what structural privileges are you talking about? I am actually the one who is vulnerable. I am the one who is insecure. And I think that we have to work within the boundaries of that lived experience to communicate the worldview that we want to achieve.
Rachel, quickly.
I would go back from my perspective, which is really on preventing identity-based violence and coming out of that space. If I look at the long-term goal, I think it has to be, this will always be a question that's up for conversation. It is everywhere around the world. So the question is, what type of conversation are we having? Is it one that respects people's dignities? Or is it this highly partisan conversation in which we're willing to accept views and go to extremes and accept narratives of threat, which take the conversation really out of the scope of a question about what's best for society as a whole and into this really sort of team sports dynamic. And so I would say the long-term goal is that the conversation becomes a qualitatively different type of conversation that's not happening in this threat environment. And if I were to say the long-term, decades goal, it's not a partisan anymore, right, at the end of it. But what this requires isn't just one message that gets hammered in over time, right? It's everything that we're talking about here. It's building that infrastructure, that human and relational infrastructure of messengers, of people that are able to consistently learn about how people are feeling and where they're at, that's able to deliver messages through communities, right? It's activating local messengers who are able to engage with this in a thoughtful way. And those are the people who are going to be able to consistently update the message, tailor it as the dynamics of our politics, the dynamics of the world of migration shift. And so I think that the focus I would put to two things. How do we qualitatively change how we're having the conversation and the type of conversation we're having? And in the immediate term, focus really on this question of how are we building the infrastructure necessary to learn from and about people and their concerns, and consistently be updating that message through messengers that people know and trust and that understand their day-to-day lives. And so it's really exciting to be on a webinar with so many people I've seen in the sidebar from all over, because I think that that's where you get the power to really do it.
Thank you. And we've gone over time, but just penultimate question to Mohammed. So much of this is about threat. What have you learned about assuaging people's feelings and thoughts about immigration being a threat?
It's actually, what's interesting is that initially when we walked into this work, specifically around the messaging, we thought that there was a higher relevancy when speaking about immigration through the lens of perception of threat, but actually authority and respecting traditions of authority in the United States actually is a much more accurate and statistically representative core belief across our work. And we're leaning into that at greater depth over the course of the next few months as we conduct sort of additional analyses. But specific respect for traditions of authority, rule of law, respect for the office, etc. This really resonates with the vast swath of this country who are really seeing this and feeling this issue every single day, on their streets, in their communities, and in their states. So.
And this speaks to some of your messaging as well as some of what Justin was saying. Rule of law is the counterpoint to, Christian values or welcoming the stranger. It really has become the bedrock of the anti-immigrant or the less welcoming movement that we're a nation of laws, and we need to respect that. Thank you very much for all of you for being with us for this incredible panel. I'm not letting you go yet. I want 10 seconds, each of you, to give our attendees one thing that they can do immediately to help change the conversation on immigration. Caitlin, let's start with you.
They reach out to your conservative loved one and ask them about something that you know they've been having a hard time with, and start to rebuild that relationship.
Rachel?
I would similarly say, start with figuring out what is the community or space that you have the opportunity to learn about that might be complementary to others in your network, and start to learn from them how they view this issue, so you can use that to build broader strategies with the others that you work with that can reach new audiences.
Mohammed?
I would say to lean into a shared vision or style of a conversation that really, as my former mentor would say, you want to lean into the seeds of a conversation, not the weeds of a conversation, because seeds grow and weeds don't. So that would be.
Justin?
Yeah, this is beyond just sort of practicing the good habits of listening. I actually think that we need to be asking ourselves some of these tough questions. I think we need to take time to think, to be the creators of how we balance heritage with progress, how we balance diversity with a sense of solidarity. I think we have to be the authors of this, and we can't rely on answers from outside of our communities. We have to be the ones who create these things and plant these intellectual seeds locally.
And Kimberly?
Here to all of these, and I would just add being able to get in touch with what is each of our immigration story, whether that's from 10 generations ago or yesterday, or whether that's a friend or family member that we love deeply, being able to get in touch with that and get comfortable sharing that story.